Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Sudarshana Sen, Associate Professor, School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University. This paper is Methodology of Research in Sociology and the module number is 21. Name of the module is Explanation of Quantitative Data. Quantitative data and its explanation is more akin to the use of positivist tradition in sociology. This dates back to the birth of sociology and the sociological research. This tradition was first popularized by Emil Durkheim in his famous studies on suicide. In sociology, like any other disciplines, causation, reliability, validity, prediction and control are important questions that need to be carefully taken up in the research process. The adequate time for question on this matter is also important. It is important to note that after we consider testing the hypothesis, the researcher is in a position to take important decisions on the nature of explaining the data. There is no firm consensus as to the nature of theory to be used in research to explain what is it in the data that needs to be explained or how that is to be explained. Some would take up a deductive model and there are others who might like to explain the data from an inductive theoretical perspective. There appears to be two accepted models of explaining the data. One approach is called understanding as espoused by Weber, Dilthey and Wittdelband. The other is the positivist tradition where prediction is the key to explanation. The proponents of this perspective hold that all theories must have predictive powers, or more recently accepted version is logico-deductive approach. The key component to correct prediction is control. If the researcher is able to control the effects of strategic variables, he or she must be equally be able to determine events and collect details of the conditions in which these events take place. Only the knowledge of necessary and sufficient conditions will be important to manipulate the conditions leading to causality. What is quantitative data? In order to understand what constitutes quantitative data, we first need to know what its sources are. The common methods employed in quantitative research are surveys and experiments. The three other techniques of data collection used in such research are secondary analysis of official document, structured observation and content analysis. All of these methods are used with a desire to produce data which can be analyzed in a logical structured way similar to that of natural sciences. Quantitative data is gathered with the assumption that the social world can be observed, recorded and effectively measured. This is carried out with operationalized concepts so as to produce measures or indicators to be precise. The use of closed questions in a survey, measurement scales in an experiment and the use of counts in structured observation are those tools that are concerned with closing down of the data into a format which produces numerical data that can be put to statistical analysis. However, not all quantitative data starts out with numerical data unless the researcher wants to measure the data in numerical units such as age, sex, caste, etc. For example, the preference for the color pink is not in itself a quantitative data unless the response pink have been taken from a list of different colors, each of which has been numbered and where the color pink happens to have numerical code 6, for example, attributed to it. When attributing such codes, the researcher seeks to transform the format of the data from textual to numerical so that it can be analyzed using statistical analysis. Logic of science. A methodology involves presenting the rules of procedures about collection of data and their analysis. The rules are impersonal, which means two researchers working with the same approach should arrive at the same results. Thereby, it is hoped that the individual biases can be excluded from the research process. In this way, methodology tries to standardize the practice of social sciences. It is commonly assumed that the theories survive because they explain facts, but a good theory is potentially falsifiable not just by contradictory facts, not by combination of contradictory observations with rival theories that explain them. Theorizing, therefore, is an inevitable part of the research process. Gathering facts alone is never enough. Scientific methods systematically seek to annihilate the individual scientist's standpoint not by impossible effort to substitute objectivity, but by substituting rules for intersubjective criticism, debate, measurement, estimating parameters, logically inducing and deducing, etc. The scales of measurement, basis for criticizing or rejecting, acts as the primary base. What is explaining quantitative data? The first genetic explanation consists of explaining why a phenomenon exists in its present form by tracing its historical development from the earlier form. Second, intentional explanation is simple everyday practice of explaining his or her intentions to act in a particular way. These are innate drives. Third, dispositional explanation actions on the part of an individual, why a person is selfish and so on. Fourth, explanations through reasons is also used to explain puzzling actions of individuals. This explanation tries to answer the question why a person is acting in a particular way. Fifth, functional explanation explains the functioning of society as a system. It is best suited to explain the existence of a phenomenon. It is not well suited to explain changes except for the fact that the phenomenon in question explains a function for the society. Sixth, explanation through empirical generalization is hypothesizing that a relationship exists and then testing this hypothesis. An empirical generalization is a statement of relationship and then generalization to say that the observed relationship holds in all cases. Seventh, formal theory is a theoretical form used in physical sciences. It is a deductive system of theory consisting of axioms. The theories which entail axioms are in fact theoretical laws open to testing only by their logical consequences, and the set of definitions that appear in the axioms are descriptive terms introduced only for proving the theorems. Philosophies of explanation. The philosophy of science is concerned with the underlying logic of the scientific model. It contains two parts, ontology and epistemology. Ontology deals with the question what exists, and epistemology deals with the question what can be known and how can we know it. The answers to these questions are highly contested and are spread over a number of theoretical paradigms. The varieties of positivist approach have two distinguishing features. One of these states that the explanation can be of observable and measurable events. This ontological position defends value-freak facts where observation acts as a mirror, that is, what is being observed, that is, what is being measured cannot be changed by being observed and discards any explanation based on authority. This train of thought flags for any observation that is independent of any theoretical statements that might be constructed around them and contends that beliefs, emotions and values are outside the realm of science and therefore not fit to be part of scientific research. Objectivity along with generalization and explanation are fundamental characteristics of science. Social science research offers knowledge about the social world which is not necessarily available by other means. Research thus in social science becomes more than mere reflection of opinions and prejudices. Research in social science substantiates, refutes, organizes or generates theories and produces evidences which may challenge not only our own beliefs but also those of society in general. Objectivity is therefore defined as the basic conviction that there is some permanent ahistorical framework to which we can ultimately appeal in determining the nature of rationality, knowledge, truth, reality, goodness, or rightness. The other approach states that explanation can be based on regularity, that is, one event causes another if it is regularly followed by it. It contends that generalized knowledge is obtained by identifying such constant regularities. Therefore, quantitative research aims at finding out patterns as association between variables. In the epistemological outlook, it prefers universal regularity to causation. In these two approaches, the truth or falsity of theoretical statements is not the issue, but that knowledge is judged true because it is useful. The underlying logic is that being able to predict means to be able to explain, and being able to predict allows control. Realism argues that the knowledge people have of the social world affect their behavior, and that causes are not simply determining of actions, but must be seen as tendencies that produce particular effects. The task of social science research is not simply to collect observations on the social world, but also to explain these from theoretical frames which examine the underlying mechanisms which inform people's actions. The radical alternative to positivism and a branch of realism is critical realism, which thrives on the belief that there is an independent reality that science can study, develop deeper levels of explanation as causal necessity only based on regularity. Critical realism has a multi-layered and stratified ontology. It sees the world and knowledge about the world as three overlapping domains: empirical, actual, and real. The empirical contains those aspects of reality that can be experienced and observed directly or indirectly. The actual contains the aspects of reality but which may not be experienced. The real is the deeper structure or tendencies that generate a phenomenon. The actual is the outcome of the real, and the actual is the constituent parts of the events that are part of the empirical. Therefore, the three domains are intransitive in operating independently of our knowledge of them, but our knowledge of them is transitive and capable of being changed. The mechanisms that are operative in the three domains behave in a particular way because of the structure of the underlying object. The aim of critical realism is to uncover the causal powers and structures. A list of rules for post-positivists is generally in use in expanding quantitative data, that is, moving beyond observing, naming, and towards knowing. First, abstraction and classification is a key process, and the researcher must initiate to differentiate the necessary from the contingent. This requires more sophisticated theory that aids to realize that both structures and agents have causal powers. Second, open systems which involve guessing what the underlying causal mechanisms are which are operative. Third is to go back and forth with the theory and the empirical data to find out the empirical pattern suggested by the data. The researcher has to be sure that there is no pretense that the estimate arrived at are the ones that have been fitted and represent universal regularities across time and space. At this point, the researcher is expected to develop a theory. Fourth, the researcher looks for appropriate techniques for doing so. The researcher arriving at the position of expecting an explanation does not mean confirmation. The explorations of the patterns help the researcher to bring the data into sharper focus, to see the patterns at a closer look and pay attention to anomalies. Confirmation means the use of significance testing to confirm well-developed hypotheses and avoid unreliable results. Fifth is to find out the areas where assumptions are not met, that is, where the information cannot be explained by the model. Sixth, learning what were the mistakes committed and to unravel the potential areas where the model is not working. Seventh is to guard against chances and can be interpreted as genuine patterns. Eighth is to find rules that link variables by maximizing the goodness of fit between the model and the observed data. Ninth is to undertake experiments to allow formulating precise causal questions, deciphering what is needed to be controlled and strategized on this. Issues in understanding quantitative data. Researchers who adopt a positivist approach engage actively with the categories of analysis within the epistemological debate. This means the researcher has to give close look at a description of tools whereby she or he can observe systematically. It means critical reflection on how such systematization can be achieved for the phenomenon under study. It means reflecting on the research process, its location, in order to judge how far and in what way the observations that arise may predict events located in other spaces and featuring at other times. It also means finding ways to represent human action and experience that draw upon representational possibilities arising from the use of numbers. It does not imply that epistemological commitment to the belief that some absolute success or truth can be achieved in relation to reliability, validity, or generalization. There is also no assumption that there can be numerically grounded representations of social phenomena. Quantitative researchers require knowledge of a range of methods. Quantitative research can employ a number of different designs, one of which is selected at the outset depending on the kind of research question that is being answered. Experimental designs involve the manipulation of at least one independent variable to see whether or not it has any impact on the dependent variable. A cross-sectional design, often used in survey research, involves collection of quantitative data on at least two variables at one point in time and from a number of cases. These data is used to look for pattern of associations between variables. Another important criterion of quantitative research is sampling design. There are a number of strategies of sampling design out of which the researcher has to decide which one is appropriate for the research question. They should explain the sampling strategy used so that readers can judge about potential bias and limitations of the research project. The research design in a quantitative research has to start with a framed hypothesis. It is the reformulation of the research question and to form a declaration of the work to be done, including a prediction of the possible outcome so that the result can be operationalized and tested statistically. While the research in quantitative terms is planned top to down, it is wise to consider the intended outcomes at the outset. The two hypotheses are null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis is tested. Statistical tests enable the researchers to reject the null hypothesis based on specific probabilities, assuming that there is no difference between the variables as prescribed in the null hypothesis. After collecting data, the researcher has to decide on the statistical procedures to test if the data is reliable, valid, and met the entire criterion required for a statistical test. First is to carry out a range of descriptive tests. Second is to select and compute appropriate statistical tests, and third is to carry out the appropriate tests of significance. Various tests of significance exist. The most common of them all is chi-square, which tests for statistical significance in cross-tabulation tables. At this point, the researcher seeks to make inferences from the sample to the population. Critiques of quantitative approach to the analysis of data. Positivism does not pay much attention to the details of people's inner mental state. Realism may refer to people's consciousness insofar as it reflects the conditions under which they live, how structures are reproduced, and their desires and needs are frustrated. The researchers who refer to subjective states or to inner world of experiences than the world out there focus on subjectivity, where the meanings that people give to their environment and not the environment itself becomes important. Feminists have challenged the notion of unified body of thought on the social world. They have focused on gendered nature of relations, giving central importance to emotion rather than reason behind every explanation. The idea of rigorous research, disengagement, detachment from the subject of study is also of concern to them. They argue that simply seeing people as sources of data, feminists argue that research is a two-way process where there is no distinction between the researcher and the researched. The postmodernists, on the other hand, see knowledge as both local and contingent, as there are no standards beyond particular contexts by which research findings can be measured, weighed according to potential. Postmodernist researchers are anti-foundationalists and claim that there cannot be a universal standard against which science may lay claim in order to value its standards. In this module, we have studied what are the possible explanations when we collect data in terms of quantitative methodology. So, here we already know what we want to find out from the research, because we start from a theoretical position. Positivist approach is one of the approaches that can be used to explain quantitative data. Positivist approach has been the most widely used paradigm to understand quantitative data. The other approach is critical realism. Here we have studied the ontological and the epistemological position of these approaches in studying quantitative data.